Everyone in politics, everyone in the city, anyone with money is waiting to find out what Rachel Reeves is going to do in her budget, which she will deliver imminently. We will discuss what we think is going to be in it on this latest episode of Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast. In the meantime, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, has had to apologise for doing the viral 6-7 dance with a bunch of children at a school where the viral 6-7 dance is banned.
6-7. Yeah. 6-7. Everybody, 6-7. Are you doing page 6-7? Yeah. Sorry about
that. No, it's absolutely fine.
It's fine. I didn't start it, miss.
It never rains, but it pours on the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio in Salford.
And it is Chris, 6-7 at Westminster.
And also joining us with whichever TikTok dance she wants to do, it's friend of the podcast, Claer Barrett, who's consumer editor at the FT. Hello, Claire.
I've got a quick joke for you. Why is 6 scared of 7?
Ooh, why is 6 scared of 7?
Sorry, I was about to trump your punchline.
Because 7, 8, 9.
Oh, that's good.
Tell that to a child doing a silly dance.
I like that. I'm going to store that up for the breakfast table tomorrow morning, in between talking to various radio outlets about the budget. I love it.
That's up there with why did the sand blush?
Oh, yeah.
Because
the seaweed.
Oh. This is like around the Christmas table, isn't it? Pulling the crackers and reading out terrible jokes. This is fantastic.
Well, the things you do to fill the time before the budget, which is what the whole country's been doing for a year and 1 month now, because that's when the last budget was. Chris, just before we get into the budget, is there anything we need to catch up on from your trip to South Africa, your flying visit to the G20?
I don't think so. I've caught up on sleep, which was the main thing I was thinking to catch up on, having returned from South Africa. It's an awful long way to go for a one-night stay, but a privilege to do it, and fascinating to spend some time in the company of the Prime Minister, as it always is on these trips. But yeah, I don't think so, unless you're thinking of something I can't think of.
Well, I suppose Keir Starmer had a chance to catch up with his fellow European leaders so they could have a chinwag about the 28-point peace plan for Ukraine from the US, but things have moved on quite a lot since that point.
Yeah, completely.
Presumably, actually, because they had a chinwag and managed to try and get it watered down.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that what ended up happening at the G20 is that there was this huge focus on what the biggest invitee who didn't turn up was up to, i.e. Donald Trump, and how Europe could try and steer him, and so all of the questions around some sort of peace settlement in a direction that they think would be palatable to the continent and palatable to Ukraine. So it's in its own way, they all happen to be in the same place at the same time at a moment where it was perhaps useful for them to be all under the same roof.
Anyway, on to the budget, which Rachel Reeves will deliver in the House of Commons at 12:30 on Wednesday. A bit later in the calendar than these things normally are delivered, and we've had a whole avalanche of speculation. Some of it actually kind of official announcements from the government, some of it things that looked like they were semi-official things from the government that they then changed their mind about, and a whole load of just pure speculation. Before we dive into all of it, Chris, what's kind of the big kind of narrative that Rachel Reeves is signalling in advance of this big moment?
So a couple of things I think that are worth teasing out. I'm pausing momentarily as I scroll through my notes so that I can make sure I quote precisely what I was wanting to say. Here we are, I found it. So what we'll get is the Chancellor will talk about 3 cuts that she wants to make, cutting the cost of living, cutting NHS waiting lists, and cutting government debt. So that'll be framed as the 3 things that she wants to achieve. But obviously, if you're going to do any of those or all of those, then there's going to be another side to the ledger, and the other side to the ledger will be tax rises in various directions. This idea of a smorgasbord, as you were talking about with Faisal on Newscast a couple of days ago. And then the language I hear that she will use is to talk about the fair and necessary choices that she is taking. And it strikes me that whenever a chancellor at any point in human history uses the word necessary, it roughly translates as difficult, both for them and for plenty of us. So that's the kind of big picture.
And Claire, in terms of as I said, the avalanche of speculation, people are saying this is an unprecedented amount of rumouring and kites being flown and ideas being floated and then withdrawn. I just wonder if we have false memories and actually all budgets in the modern era have this.
I mean, all budgets have it to an extent, but I mean, I've been in this game now for, 20 years? I'm showing my age. And I've never known a budget to have as much speculation and kite flying than this one, partly because it's so late in the year. You know, we're only about 4 weeks away from Christmas. It's Black Friday on Friday, and I don't think anyone's bothered about that. They're all bothered about whether they're going to be hit by tax rises. Well, we know that we are, but we don't know where they're going to fall. And I mean, for me, I think my sum up about this budget on Budget Eve, knowing what we think we know, is that we should be expecting stealth taxes rather than wealth taxes. The biggest single tax raising measure of this budget looks like it's going to be freezing tax thresholds, possibly out until 2030. It was a big story that the FT reported on earlier this week.
So basically the level at which you go up the income tax brackets.
Crucially, the number in the bottom right-hand corner of your payslip will stay the same. But because those tax thresholds are set at the same rate for another 5 years, potentially, any pay rises that you get are going to be squeezed up into those higher rates of tax. So it's an income tax rise in all but name. But of course, she hasn't done that and broken the manifesto. She's doing it this way. I'm very upset about plans to cap salary sacrifice on pensions. I think that's a really retrograde step for millions of workers.
Well, do you know what? Actually, let's just take a moment to explain what that is, because not everyone will have salary sacrifice for their pension contributions. So give us the basics, first of all, of what we have now.
So the basics are, if you work for a big company in the private sector, almost certainly your pension payments will be arranged through what's called salary sacrifice. It's a tax treatment that firms and workers legitimately use. The government brought it in a long time ago to encourage companies to incentivise their staff to save more into pensions, because it doesn't charge either the workers or the employer national insurance contributions on the money that they save or sacrifice into a pension. Now, if you're a person, you pay either 8% or 2% national insurance on your money. So you get that saving as well as the income tax if you put it into your pension. But the really big saving is for employers, because they don't have to pay 15% employers' national insurance contributions on the money that they're putting in on our behalf. And sadly, lots of big employers are telling the FT that, as well as workers being hit by the tax hit on this money not going into their pensions, they're planning on saving money by reducing the generosity, how much they're actually giving to people as an additional pension contribution. So that's why I think it's very damaging, but it's quite a clever one to do, because it won't necessarily change your payslip from day one. A lot of people think it will take about 18 months for this to come in, because things like payrolls are so expensive, but it will make life a lot harder for people who are trying to stay out of those higher bands of tax. And of course, if we get the threshold freeze for another 5 years, there's going to be a lot more of those people who'll be running into admin woe as well as tax pain.
And Chris, we don't know if both those things are actually going to be in the budget. That's still in the category marked speculation, although some newspapers are pretty convinced that they are going to happen.
I hope they're not.
I suppose, Chris, if they do happen, they actually are still okay in the terms of Labour's manifesto, because it's not increasing the rate of income tax or national insurance. It's just finding new bits of money to put national insurance and income tax on.
Yeah, it looks pretty likely that both of those things, I think, will happen. And yeah, this gets us to the, if you like, the intersection between political promises and then economic levers that a chancellor can pull to try and generate revenue. And so, we've had this whole process, haven't we, playing out in public of the anguish that the government has felt over whether or not it could politically get away with increasing the rates of income tax. The basic rate of income tax hasn't changed for half a century, so it became known as the 50-year taboo that it hasn't been done. And in addition to that, it was in Labour's manifesto that they wouldn't do it. They were seriously contemplating doing it. There was that news conference at breakfast time a couple of weeks ago where the Chancellor was kind of laying the ground for doing it. And then they changed their mind. And what looks likely instead, amongst a range of other things, as Claire was saying, is this idea of the thresholds remaining frozen. And so this idea known as fiscal drag, where people get hauled into higher tax rates because their salary goes up and in some instances crosses those thresholds. In other words, where you're able to put up people's taxes without actually doing anything. And you're not changing something that is seen to be politically salient thresholds, A, because it always has income tax rates, and B, because you promised you wouldn't do it. And instead, you're doing something without doing something at some point down the track. The tricky thing for Rachel Reeves, if she does that on thresholds, is there is a quote that will be forever played back to her, and already has been played back to her and the Prime Minister, was her making a virtue last year of doing the opposite, and saying that doing the opposite helped working people, which is that two-word phrase that lies at the heart of so much of what Labour will articulate as the people that they are standing up for.
And in terms of working people and how much working people earn, that's something we do know for definite, because at 6 o'clock this evening on Tuesday, we got a press release from the Treasury confirming a big thing that is going to be in the budget, and it's increases to the national living wage, which is paid to people over age 21, if that's the wage that they're on, and the national minimum wage, which is paid for 18 to 20-year-olds who are on the national minimum wage. And so the national living wage is going to go up by 4.1% in April next year, which will take it to £12.71 an hour. And then the other rate for younger people will go up 8.5% to £10.85 an hour. And that's the government basically following advice from the Low Pay Commission, who look at it every year and say, right, this is how much you should increase those rates by. And Rachel Reeves saying, yeah, tick, I will.
Yeah, and this is a example, as the Treasury would see it, of trying to generate some headlines prior to the budget that they would regard as good news. There's an argument to be had about where it leaves the employment market for those on those minimum and living wages. But that's certainly from the Treasury's news management point of view what they are seeking to do, conscious that when we're talking about tax rises, when we get the whole thing on Wednesday, then some of the, if you like, as they would see it, good news can get squeezed out a bit. So trail it the day before and it becomes a headline in its own way.
And Claire, what do you think employers will think about these big boosts to the national living wage and the national minimum wage?
Well, the FT did a story this morning about how the shifts that we're already seeing in the labour market as a result of the higher employers' national insurance at the last budget is increasing employers' use of AI, hiring robots effectively rather than hiring people. And then sectors such as sales, customer service, retail, jobs growth has fallen faster than expected, we've reported, because people are thinking, well, if we invest in AI software, if we have a friendly chatbot answering our customers' queries instead of a human being, I mean, you can see where this is going. I think that the cost of this tax rate on employers, if we do get this salary sacrifice change, it could raise anywhere between £2 billion and £4 billion. People who are in the know have speculated in the FT. You know, that's a pretty big chunk. The income tax freeze by the end of the Parliament is expected to raise around £8 billion. So that's the single biggest tax raising measure we're likely to see in the budget. So the salary sacrifice one, a lot of people don't really understand how it's going to hit them. Arguably, many won't realise until they reach retirement and find out that their pension pot is a lot smaller than it otherwise would have been. But it's another burden on employers. It's another cost that's been loaded on if they have to pay this tax, if they're employing lots of lower waged workers, like in sectors like retail and hospitality. They're the parts of the business world that were really screaming last time after the budget imposed those outside costs. But we're also getting supermarkets moaning tonight already because they think that they're going to be left out of exemption on business rates, which we had thought that supermarkets and bigger retailers would be left out on. Again, the FT is expecting that is going to be reversed tomorrow. So there's still lots of moving parts in this budget. I mean, one question I'd love to ask Chris is, do you think there are any surprises left to come? Because it feels like we've had all of the news already. But whenever I felt like this about budgets before, there's always been something that comes out.
Claire, it's the rabbit question, isn't it? That we ask ourselves at this point in the cycle. In other words, with under 24 hours to go until the budget, will there be a rabbit out of the hat? The expectation that has been sort of dripped into my ears this afternoon as we record on the evening before the budget is to not expect any kind of rabbit out of the hat, that is seen by the Chancellor to be kind of game playing and theatrics.
It's not a very Rachel Reeves thing to do,
exactly,
is it?
and that you wouldn't do it. I think it's fair to say, though, that there's been a sort of Watership Down-esque number of rabbits running around in the preceding months in the countdown to the
and then
to
getting
the budget.
myxomatosis.
And they've been running around since some children were still on their summer holidays, and right now winter is knocking at the door. So in that sense, perhaps there's been plenty of that in advance rather than it being saved up for the day itself.
And actually, we should say there have been a few sort of like goodies that the government's announced in the last few days. So things like freezing lots of rail fares in England next year so that they don't go up with inflation, freezing the cost of prescriptions for lots of people as well. And so Rachel Reeves would say, there are things that are helping with the cost of living and that make a genuine difference to some people's outgoings. Also, Chris, you talked about the other priority being the NHS. So far, all I can see on the NHS, it's still a lot of money, it's hundreds of millions of pounds, is confirmation of funding for these neighbourhood health centres in England, which were part of the 10-year plan, which we spoke to the Health Minister Stephen Kinnock about on Newscast a couple of months ago. I just wonder, is there going to be something else? Because if you're making the NHS one of your three priorities, confirming some money for a thing that's already been announced doesn't sound like living up to one of your priorities to me.
From what I can, it's a good question. From what I can detect from various conversations I've had, I think it's more about the absence of the alternative. In other words, the removal of money that was planned to contribute towards trying to drive down that incredibly high number of people in England, and indeed elsewhere, but in England, that are on NHS waiting lists. And that if you could have made a decision, given the nature of the spreadsheets that the Chancellor is confronting, to pull back from some of that, and that they won't. In other words, the alternative would be what they would describe as some sort of austerity, and they don't want to go there. I don't think necessarily, therefore, there will be a moment where there is some huge new pot that is pointed at that can revolutionise the challenge that they're attempting in terms of driving those waiting lists down. That seems to be how it's being framed. And the other argument I think we'll get, just in the round, taking half a step back from that, Adam, from the Chancellor, is that, yes, a year ago she talked about a kind of once in a parliament, even once in a generation budget, yet here we are again with all of the talk that there's been about tax rises. I think she'll make an argument that says, or at least the argument will be made, either outright in the speech or in the kind of commentary around it, that the circumstances have changed. So we've seen the international picture change, not least all of the questions around Donald Trump and tariffs. Then there's been the government's own decisions, not least that about turn, for instance, on welfare, which the Treasury were at pains to point out instantly in the summer would have a consequence come the budget in terms of the difficult decisions that they're having to take. And I've forgotten what my third point was going to be, so I'll stop, and when
That's
I remember
fine.
it, I'll chip it in.
Save something for tomorrow.
Yeah.
Also, talking about that moment at the CBI conference a year ago where Rachel Reeves was asked, are you going to come back with another budget in this Parliament that raises something like 40 billion of taxes like she did last time? And she said, nope, that's a once in a lifetime or once in a Parliament thing. And this phrase, one and done, I just keep hearing it. I don't know where it's come from. Everyone's saying, Rachel Reeves says this is going to be a one and done, but it's not. And I now just keep hearing that phrase one and done popping up everywhere. Claire, a few other things that are really on your beat. ISAs, so your tax-free savings accounts, which at the moment somebody can save £20,000 a year without having to pay any tax on the interest, and that can be split between a cash ISA or a stocks and shares ISA, up to a total of £20,000 across both. We think that actually the amount you could put into a cash ISA is going to be, well, to use tabloid language, slashed.
Yeah, well, you would be accurate there. That's certainly what we're hearing. Rachel Reeves is expected to announce that £12,000 is going to be the cap for cash ISAs. Now, you may very well say, well, thank you, Adam. I'd love to have £12,000 to stash away in a savings account. Most people who do use ISAs are paying in far less than that in their annual subscriptions. But the reason why the Chancellor has done this isn't to cynically try and raise tax revenues on charging us tax on our savings interest, although I'm sure she will raise some money by doing that. This is allegedly to try and convince more people to put their money into stocks and shares ISAs, to use the stock market for their long-term investments, where they're perhaps likely to get a better return over the longer term than sticking their money in cash, where it can be eaten away by inflation. But I mean, I've written in the FT many times that I think this is the wrong way to do it. I don't think by limiting how much you can put in per year to a cash ISA, you're going to get a big rush of people suddenly wanting to invest, because we honestly don't know how to in this country. It's not part of our national psyche. We're very risk averse. I'm really glad that a couple of weeks ago that the government said that it is finally, thank goodness, going to put personal finance properly on the curriculum in every primary and secondary school in England. But if we're going to teach people about investing, we really need to give them a carrot rather than a stick. Now, we might get a very small carrot tomorrow if they get rid of stamp duty on buying UK shares, but I think they're only going to get rid of it on companies that are new to market, companies that raise money on the UK stock market. If you buy their shares in their stocks and shares ISA, then maybe you'll be able to avoid the stamp duty on that. But really, I don't think it's going to move the needle to create this nation of investors that the Chancellor wants. Arguably, if she could let us save more money into our workplace pensions, many, many more people have those rather than a stocks and shares ISA. So not impressed.
And not to blow our own trumpet, but one of the first places that Rachel Reeves theorised about what she might do with ISAs to encourage people to invest was this very podcast, when we recorded an interview with her in number 11 Downing Street in the summer. And I remember it very clearly because it was absolutely boiling that day. And because we filmed it, we made her close the curtains. Anyway, Claire, another thing for people's bills, council tax. So this is being dubbed the mansion tax. I'm not sure it's quite accurate to call it that. But what do we think is going to be the mechanism by which the government makes people in expensive houses pay maybe a little bit extra on their council tax or a new... What do we think? Brainstorm it with me.
Well, I should start by saying, if the Chancellor stood up tomorrow and said, I want to do a root and branch reform of council tax, I would wholly support her, because the whole system is based on valuations that were conducted in 1991. I think pretty much everybody knows this by now.
Yeah, the day before my 11th birthday. I just checked today. It was April the 1st, 1991.
Gosh, I'm not going to
and I'm
follow you
45
in
now.
admitting my age. But nevertheless, so we've sort of moved away from reforming the system to saying, oh, we're just going to look at the top three bands, F, G and H, and revalue all the properties in those. And then, that's quite a lot of properties in London, where Labour obviously has a huge voter heartland. So let's restrict it to properties above £1.5 million in value. And again, this is all rumour and conjecture. We don't know if any of this is true, but it's been weighing on the property market for the last few months. And then earlier this week, we start to hear that actually they want to start the threshold at which these extra bans, extra charges would be made above £2 million. So every time this is happening, you're getting a smaller and smaller tax base upon which to levy these charges on. It's going to take years, we think, to conduct like a proper valuation of these houses. They're obviously owned by wealthy people who may well challenge those valuations. And again, it's yet another example of how this smorgasbord of more difficult taxes is really risky. You know, is it going to raise the revenue that she wants quickly? That's what the jury is out on. And, you know, the biggest thing that we'll be watching in the FT newsroom tomorrow, I mean, we'll have one eye on the Chancellor's speech, but we'll have another eye on the markets desk and what's going on the bond markets, you know, how government gilts
the cost of government debt. I have to say, I went down the council tax rabbit hole today, hence my excitement about the fact that they did the valuations the day before my birthday, which I didn't notice at the time, I have to admit. I was probably watching Thundercats. But
Super Ted.
Exactly. No, I was probably a bit old for Super Ted.
I was still into Super Ted in 1991.
I hadn't realised actually how the ratios for the different council tax bands are worked out. So Band E, for example, a Band E property's rate is 13/6 of a Band A property. A Band F, is 1360. Turn this into a ringtone. Yeah, Band F property is 13/16 of the rate on an A. A Band G is 15/16 of a Band A, and a Band H is 18/6 of a Band A. In other words, 3 times a Band A. A Band H is 3 times Band A because it's 18/6.
Okay.
That's how it's written in the legislation.
Wow.
Still awake, everyone? Still awake, everyone?
I'm glad you spent your day as wholesomely as you did. You should do 5 Live Breakfast more often. And somewhere at the heart of all of this, and both of you can help me out with this, Claire, Adam, is this whole business, isn't it, around the argument that some make that you can have a property that is sizable but not vast and something that's akin to Buckingham Palace, and they're both paying similar rates of council tax.
In different parts of the country.
Yeah.
Hence why I would be supportive if the Labour Party said, we think that this is a really unfair tax, agree, and it needs to be reformed. But we're kind of moving away from making the tax system better to pulling a lever quickly to try and bring in tax revenue and focus it on an ever-dwindling number of the very richest people at the top. And it's just kind of moving further and further away from the reform that we desperately need. I mean, just to go back to the income tax thresholds, I mean, some of these haven't changed for, decades, and it's creating distortions within the system. There are some people who get to the £100,000 salary threshold. I know people don't feel sorry for them, but they think, well, if I'm going to pay 62% tax on anything I earn above £100,000, I'm just going to drop down to a 4-day week. And this is happening within the NHS. So
and we should explain the
waiting lists.
The reason it's 62% is that once you hit £100,000 of earnings, the personal allowance for income tax decreases.
It's tapered away. So that
so the
tax-free
effective
allowance
tax rate
at the
is
bottom
62.
is taken off. And, this is something that politicians can say, well, if you're earning a 6-figure salary, then, you should be able to pay a bigger tax bill. But it's the actions that people are taking to avoid it, which are having real world economic consequences. And if we've got another 4 or 5 years of that threshold being frozen, then, that's hundreds of thousands of people who could be squeezed into that band. And if they all start, dropping their hours working part-time, where will we be then? It's not encouraging growth, but nobody really wants to grasp these tax thistles and deal with them. We just want to patch things and try and get more revenue coming in. And the delay with the revenue collection with a lot of these policies is, I think, the biggest risk in this budget. Lots of things are backloaded to the later years of the Parliament, and that, I think, is going to be the crucial test for investors tomorrow. Are they going to believe that this money can come in and that government debt can come down?
And the mirror image of that, Adam and Claire, just picking up on what you were saying there, Claire, is the concern amongst particularly Labour MPs who I've been speaking to today, that if you go for, as she will go for, the Chancellor, this sort of smorgasbord of different taxes, what happens, as one rural Labour MP put it to me, is if you create a whole load of equivalents of the farmers with their tractors who were heading straight for, and indeed are heading straight for, Westminster on budget day to protest about last year's inheritance tax changes for them. In other words, defined and, if you like, coherent interest groups, some of whom have already got their own sort of mechanisms for lobbying governments around things, who then are confronted by a particular tax imposed upon them that they then make a lot of noise about, potentially a disproportionate amount of noise relative to the amount of income the Treasury can generate from that particular lever being pulled. And then, if you like, the overlap, Claire, with your point in terms of how the markets then see it, is the extent to which those taxes are seen as credible, because could they be the sort of thing that a Chancellor feels that they have to reverse out of in the end if there's a whole, volume of anger and frustration and march and protest that comes down the track?
We've seen a lot of U-turns from the last budget already. Look at the winter fuel allowance. And
completely. In other words, both from the market's perspective and from campaigners' perspective, we know this government has a track record of changing its mind when the heat is on.
And I've just looked up the definition of smorgasbord on a well-known online encyclopedia.
Did you spell
it right? I did, yes, although I didn't put the little accents on.
Oh, that's wrong then.
It's customary to begin with cold fish dishes. People usually continue with a second course and round off with hot dishes. Dessert may or may not be included, which seems like actually quite a good metaphor. Something cold, something hot, and maybe or not some dessert.
Pudding. No pudding.
Yeah, well, no guaranteed pudding.
No, right.
Although didn't Rachel Reeves say it was like pick a mix?
Yes.
When she met the Labour Party MPs a couple of days ago.
She did. So she was meeting Labour MPs on Monday night.
No, it was only last night. I'm
Yeah, it was
doing
only-
early shifts now. It seems like days ago.
Yeah, and talked about, I think she said, where's the effect of, 90 or 95% of this budget you'll be able to go out and sell. In other words, there will be some elements that will be quite difficult to sell. But talked about it being a pick and mix, and you can't just, I haven't got the exact quote in front of me, but you can't just pick the cola bottles or the fruit salad or whatever. That was the basic gist of what she was saying, which speaks to because she'll have known when she said that it would get out to us lot because there was a lot of people in the room. That speaks to this tension you've got at the moment between government and lots of Labour backbenchers about there's a frustration in government that in their view not enough Labour MPs are realistic about the trade-offs in government. Not least the row about benefits from 6 months ago, with the consequences the Chancellor will argue are very visible in the decision-making processes she's been making prior to the budget. And then Labour backbenchers who, frankly, are pretty cheesed off with the government because they just think it is incredibly unpopular and they feel the reality of that in their inboxes and on doorsteps every single day.
Right, enough food metaphors, probably enough speculation, because the next episode of Newscast will be all about what was actually in Rachel Reeves's budget.
Three cheers for that, I'd say.
Yes, and we'll also have the bonus OBR Fiscal Outlook, the blue book that tells us the OBR's version of what they think is going to happen to all these measures.
We'll actually be able to report what is definitely in it and what what the OBR is concluding about the consequences of what's in it, as opposed to
5 years hence.
Yeah, and that, as opposed to all of this stuff that I think we're all will be glad to be beyond.
Claire, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Good luck with fixing the coffee machine at the Financial Times, which sounds like it has broken on the worst possible day of the year.
I will be taking in a thermos flask.
Yes. And Chris, we will reconvene for a live episode of Newscast, which you will be able to listen to on BBC Sounds at 6:30 on Budget Day on Wednesday. And you'll also be able to watch it live on the BBC News channel and on iPlayer as well. So that's at 6:30. And I'm just double checking in the evening because I'm working in 6:30 in the morning on 5 Live Breakfast as well. So got to make sure I'm on the right one.
Yeah,
right.
And I better turn up on time.
Bye, everyone.
Ta-ra.
And thanks for listening to this episode of Newscast. Bye.